So now I'd love to open it up for questions from the audience and get a conversation going about what people what's come up for people, ideas, questions for our panelists. Talk about our food system here, our larger food system and more generally, and any visions or ideas we might have for our campus food system.
So one of the questions that I have, and I went to the college gathering a few weeks ago. It seems, from my perception, that a lot of the institutions that are interested in this tend to be smaller institutions, that feed 500, 1,000, maybe a couple thousand people, and that as you get larger and larger institutions, it becomes progressively more challenging to the point where maybe there's some cutoff point where a 20,000 student university is just not going to bother with any of this. Since all of you are practitioners, I wonder if you have anything to say directly to the issue of scale. Do you see the institutions that are more interested in getting involved in this typically being smaller? Do you see institutions of a certain size class saying, we just can't bother with this?
I don't know. I was talking to Ken Toon, who's the Director of Auxiliary Services at UMass Amherst, which is a really big institution for New England, probably the biggest actually, in terms of population of students. And I believe they're getting close to 30% of their produce anyway, sort of locally. They have a couple of big growers who are near them, who they have very strong relationships with, and have been able to, get that. They work really hard at it. They also have other things like a permaculture, operation on campus. So, I think you're right. It's because of the fact that our region doesn't produce as much food as some other regions or countries, that the supply is more limited, and so the big scale has a harder time sourcing enough product. I think that's a fair comment. And smaller institutions are more able to maybe find some creative wiggle room because they're not just buying in such large demand. But I don't think it's prohibitive. I don't think it's a deal breaker. I think there needs to be a champion and a real commitment. There needs to be some flexibility and creativity. But I think there's ways that it can happen at institutions of any scale. And in some cases, they can actually command power through that scale. There's some efforts to create collaborative efforts through that scale. There was a forum of a bunch of institutions down at Yale back in November that collectively have about $100 million of food dollars a year, about a dozen schools, and they're looking at ways that their combined purchasing power might help bring in some products that are harder to get at a price point that they've wanted. Still under works, but I think there's some opportunity there.
I was going to say UMass is actually the second largest dining hall in our country. University of Arizona is the largest, and there's currently a campaign going on there. But UMass is doing some incredible things. They actually have a student-run class for the calculator, which so students are teaching other students how to run that. It's a very organic and sustainable system that they have going on there, and I think that's necessary for such a large institution, that they actually have, like you were saying, that accountability. The other one I was going to mention is the entire University of California system signed on to 40% by 2020, and that is huge. They are actually putting real food language in their sustainability. They're creating this sustainability plan, and originally they wanted to just put sustainable. Originally, food wasn't even in their sustainability development plan at all, which is crazy. And then through the student campaign, they were going to put sustainable food in there, and then they work to have real food that encompasses more than just the sustainability aspect. So it's definitely possible for these larger institutions, although I think that access is a little bit easier for the smaller ones, but yeah.
Because you can't do it all, you got to do something.
Hi, can you hear me? I just wanted to point out, I think there are some obstacles and realities that we need to face, and they're in the way. One is, right here on campus, the quality of the institutional food compared with the hospital, there is no comparison. And students, it hasn't taken them very long to figure out, rather than going to the dining halls, they go over to the hospital. So there's the question, how is it that they're able to do it, provide good food so much cheaper? So that's a reality. And I'll get to that in a second. Another reality, I think it's the students can move things, except the obstacle there is the students, for 2 years, they're on the meal plan. And then I'm guessing the percentage that choose to go the third and fourth year are very, very, very low. So what that means is the very first semester, the entering students, they don't know what's going on, so they're not mobilized. They start becoming increasingly agitated, but then they go home, and the very students that you're hoping to mobilize, they move on to other things. So if we wanted to move things, the way to do it, and it would create a revolution here, is force all students to be here all four years. And believe me, students would rally to that. Now, I guess my last comment or reality is, I think there's a premise or an assumption that these three big food service operations, that's where we need to go. And I challenge that. That Sugar Snap can provide making money. They can provide food at a less expensive rate than you can get on campus. Something's wrong with that picture. So why is it, given that we're Vermont, why can't we think a Vermonty way rather than having one mega? And I understand from the institution standpoint, you don't have to clown around with it. There's one size does all. But why can't we consider each dining hall perhaps being a separate, smaller scale outfit so that they can behave as Dartmouth Hitchcock does, which also provides great food, less expensive, rather than we've got three choices, and once those three choices are in place, and I don't fault them, they're trying to make money, there's no competition within. There's zero competition within. Once they have the contract, unless they start killing kids, that's the way it is. However, if there were an assortment of different, each dining hall, there would be competition within, perhaps. So that's some of my soapbox. I've got a lot more.
Responses to any of those observations?
Well, I would say, I mean, there's a couple things. The times I've eaten here, I've actually really liked the food. But maybe it's been a bit in catering, but. I mean, I would just say, having spoken to the head of dining services at Dartmouth Hitchcock, I asked, does the administration set a threshold for your food budget? And she said, not really. I mean, it's similar to Jenny's experience. So I think, and you know, as a parent of a high school junior who's going to be, you know I'm going to be forking out tuition and room and board. There's a equation there in terms of the amount of resources the university is going to put into its food services. So I think, I think that any of those companies would probably provide food at whatever standard you wanted to pay for. And so it becomes, to some extent, a choice by the administration in terms of what how much of the student dollars are going to go toward the food operation. Well,
I want to hear from.
yeah, I actually think the hospital is subsidizing the food costs there, outside of what they get paid.
That's true for us. The hospital does subsidize budget.
Is anyone here from Fletcher Allen too? I'm pretty sure the food served in the Harvest Cafe, yes, is awesome. The food served to the patients is more of a dining service style, mashed potatoes, steak type of a frozen green beans deal. I'm not sure. That's from my experience living in Burlington and hearing what is served there, and how that Harvest Cafe is subsidized. Students, you're saying students are going home after break and they're forgetting about it. But what I've seen is actually this incredible spark within these students to get very agitated. And yes, they are on this meal plan. And even if they're not on that meal plan for 4 years, it's saying something that they're not on it. They decide not to go back on it for their third year. And the students are remembering what they're eating there. You know, it's your first experience as a college freshman, to go into your dining room and get that first all-you-can-eat plate of whatever it is. But they're having those experiences and understanding that this is all interconnected. What they're eating is still part of it's part of that food system. And when we do our corporate food service workshop and they understand the entire chain, they're getting really agitated about this, and we do see students coming back and really fighting for this. I mean, that's why we have 21 campuses that have signed on to this commitment, because of the students that are there.
I don't want to put Sodexo folks on the spot, but do you happen to know the percentage of students who stay on the meal plan after they move on? No idea? Okay. I've heard it's actually maybe more than we would assume. So just want to throw that out there. I also just want to mention that we've seen some first-year students get involved with the Real Food Challenge within their first semester at UVM, which was really exciting for me as a staff person supporting that endeavor. So as the food system conversation becomes more a part of people's everyday experiences in reading Michael Pollan, maybe in high school before they even get here, I think that there's more opportunities to engage students when they first arrive on campus and get them connected.
I go to Lincoln State College, and we're in the process of handing over the torch because we're all seniors and we'll be leaving. So it's important that we have kids to take on the calculator process. And how did you get your freshmen to be so engaged? Did you just table at events, or?
Well, I can tell a little bit, and then maybe Kierstin can respond also. At UVM, we were doing some tabling. Some of our students were going to classes, and we specifically recruited from some key clubs that we knew were interested in food and got representatives from them. And then this semester, the students have also started doing Real Talks, which are an event that they're trying to get students to come to and basically have conversations about the food system on campus and how students would like to see the Real Food Campus commitment implemented. Kierstin, do you want to talk a little bit about engaging?
With Real Food Challenge, we offer these leadership development trainings and retreats year-round. So while we have the national summit, and while in this late winter, early spring, we tend to do these regional retreats. Organizers and coordinators like myself and other Real Food Challenge staff are available to come to campus to do a variety of workshops. And that's where we see a lot of students really getting involved, because at events that the students put on their campuses, for example, tabling, or they might have, I don't know, various like anything involving with food, potlucks, and all these fun events that happen draws a lot of especially freshmen in. And then if we can get them to the retreat, they, like I was saying before, they understand the entire system a lot more, and it all starts to make sense, and all the pieces start to come together, and they understand that they can be a part of this, and they actually do have a voice, and that's really powerful. A lot of the students that come away from the summits and the retreats have this incredible sense of power that they didn't even realize that they had before, which is incredibly powerful for me to have seen that through my year with RFC, and that's where we see these students coming back for more.
Also here at UVM, we have Allison that works with the Real Food Challenge, and so it's someone who gives each of those students on the Real Food Challenge supportive help in being there, and I think that has also made a big difference this year.
Other questions?
Because institutions are have to be bottom line driven, what is the impetus for an institution to sign on? They don't make more money from the students who want real food. They don't, their profit margins may shrink. So what gets them on board?
So why these institutions will sign on to the 20% commitment? So students are paying tuition to go to the college. Without the students, professors, administration wouldn't be in a market. They wouldn't have a job. And institutions have a certain amount of students that they need to enroll every year into their university. And any way that they can make that more popular, more flashy, more attractive to these students is going to be attractive to administration as well. We have a little diagram that we use in RFC a lot that dining, administration, and students are all connected, because administration answers to dining, administration answers to students, and dining answers to administration. It's this full circle that happens. So really, the universities are signing on to this commitment because of students. It might not necessarily. You're right. At first, this is very intimidating. They could lose money. They could, something could go wrong. This might not work. Which I think why a lot of the time students are met with a closed door or an unanswered email a lot of the time. But what I've seen is the student power and then allies that. Administrative and faculty allies within the university that help them get over those barriers to understand that this can actually happen. And then the universities see that they can actually make change. So I used the California state example earlier. I'm working with students at SUNY Plattsburgh who are starting possibly a statewide campaign for the entire SUNY system, which I think encompasses about 60 schools. Which is incredible, and this is just starting. I mean, we are always learning from every single campaign that happens, but it's the students that drive the commitment, and then the universities see all of the how it's benefiting the rest of their community as well.
Ginny, can you speak a little bit to what you think the incentive is for hospitals? Because my understanding is that there's the lines being connected between the dots of diet and health and healthcare costs down the line.
Well, I think, if we aren't willing to set an example to the community, then, we're never going to get anywhere. So I think just that commitment from the administration gives us the seed money to keep it going. And, at some point we're probably going to have to increase prices so that you pay for what you get. But I think that the cost is not really that significantly different. In fact, our food budget's gone down. We've just started doing doing better with waste, kind of changing recipes that aren't going, changing the amount that we offer. I love that concept of, this is not a trough. This is, so we do get some pushback when we really serve a 3-ounce piece of meat, but that's a serving. And if we could just kind of get real with that and have that be enough, as long as it's a quality piece of meat.
Well, I would just say, why do universities spend millions of dollars on new buildings? It doesn't necessarily immediately transfer to the bottom line. Sometimes it's because somebody gave them money to do that, and sometimes it's because they think that's what it's going to take to retain quality faculty and bring more students in. There are schools where alumni are actually donating to the food operation. Someone gave Bates $250,000 to support its a lot of it going to the dining operations, and they're buying almost 30% of their food just from Maine in the last few years. So when all of you get out of here and make your first couple million, chunk of 1 or 2 back here, and you could endow a meal or something. But I do think the point about how do we value food and what kind of commitment to food as a part of our culture and a part of our experience, it takes involvement from a lot of different entities. The food service tends to get, they're the ones who are making the meals, and there's no question about it, but there's a lot of other entities that help define the type of food that's going to end up being served, the amount of money that's going to be put toward it, how it's going to be marketed, how it's going to be justified. And I think thinking about it from all those perspectives helps us move farther, particularly in a complex system like a university food service operation, which is a huge operation. Lots of meals every day, lots of dollars, lots of people. Which is not, I'm not being an apologist for anyone in the system, but just acknowledging the complexity of it.
It's really just a specific question for Jean, because you said you have, or Janine, you said you have local growers. So do you allow them to drive right up to the hospital to make their delivery? Then good. Because that's an advantage you have over everybody else.
I was just wondering how, in practice, to what extent food hubs or any kind of other middlemen played in procuring local food, or if they made that easier, or if you're actually using them.
I think we're just starting to use food hubs a little bit better, more effectively, because we've been just having individual, relationships. We haven't really done a lot with food hubs, but I think that's probably, if we're going to talk about the future, that's probably the most efficient way to source that. Yeah. I'm close to Hardwick, so, and Hardwick is kind of the food hub, so.
Say 2 quick things there. One is there is a really interesting annual study that's done by the Wallace Center on food hubs across the country every year, and the one that came out in November, it shows what percentage of food hubs sell to schools, colleges, hospitals, and so a lot of them, well, maybe 25 or 30% more or less do, but in terms of the amount of business it is for the food hub, it's way less, like 10% or less. And so there's this question of like, why can't, because it's a great question, if there's a bunch of small farms, could an aggregator get it, which makes the delivery easier to an institution? But for the most part, it's not the way there's the most local food getting to institutions, so why not? And the obvious answer is, well, that's another middleman, so it's cost. But there was just a national conference last week in North Carolina of food hubs, and I wasn't there, but I heard that the keynote speaker said, price actually isn't the issue, it's salesmanship. So a lot of food hubs are run by people who go into it because they really care about local food, and they come either from a farming or a nonprofit perspective, And if they could enhance their just business and marketing and salesmanship skills, they'd probably be more effective at getting that product into the distribution system. Because it's not inherently a price challenge, which was sort of the perception. And so I thought it was really inspiring. And UVM is part of a process to train food hub managers around business skills, which is a really exciting initiative. Eric DeLuca, right.
Middlebury actually is one of the schools that uses food hubs to get a lot of their food, because they have a lot of small farms. I'm not sure which one it is, and even the schools down Raffle, Rutland Area Farm and Food Link does a lot of work with institutions down in central Vermont, southern Vermont. That's what I've heard. So it's and that I think you're right, because I worked with Raffle one of my semesters at UVM, and that was where they needed help, was in their marketing, because they're awesome at doing what they're doing with connecting farmers to different buyers, but they needed some help in the stages along the way.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
This is a question mostly for Peter and Kierstin, I think. But the fact that universities and schools are on no summer, students aren't there in the summer. So could you speak a little bit about those challenges that have to do with seasonality and being in New England and having our growing season? What are some strategies to overcome that for farmers and for the institutions?
Right. Schools aren't in session in the summer because kids are supposed to be home on the farm. So I think there's three things. One is farmers are actually extending the growing season through the use of high tunnels and things like that. Secondly, if you buy, root crops are available year-round, and some other products aren't so seasonally affected. And third, there is some light processing operations that are going in to, prepare foods that will enable it to last longer through freezing primarily. There's a project we're doing looking at 7 processing facilities in New England who are talking together about what kind of, staffing and equipment and capital and different issues they're facing. And, the Franklin County Food Processing Center in Western Mass just sent a huge amount of cut carrots to some colleges in Boston a couple of weeks ago that were grown last summer. So it's possible, again, price to process that food, you add a fair bit to the price, but I think it's an important part of the system, part of the strategy.
And going off the other side of that, so not procurement, but into even what the students do over the summer, going on to those farms and understanding what's happening and who those growers and producers are. Now that Real Food Challenge is in its 4th, 5th year, one thing they're doing, they hired 10 students to actually look at the impact that the commitment in the calculator is having on these different schools and across these different communities. And so these students are actually going into those communities, spending time with the producers, with those growers, and kind of understanding how this is actually impacting them, which is really important. But even, taking that time over the summer to do these different studies and actually help to grow that food and become actually part of that food system is really important too. So that's something, those leadership development projects that are happening over the summer are also really important.
All right, one more quick question.
Going to be involved with the negotiations with Sodexo for the new contract? And if so, who invited them to the table? And maybe that could happen at the state college, because we'll be doing the same thing in 2 years.
I say, where'd Doug go? Are there students on the RFP committee?
So my understanding is that there's not students directly on the RFP committee itself, but they've been SGA and some other student organizations. The Real Food Working Group, we did a process where we brainstormed a bunch of ideas of what we'd like to see in the next contract, prioritized them, and just sent them to the RFP committee. And the students totally led that process and had a really strong voice in it. So we basically didn't wait to be invited. We just said, we feel like, and they welcomed it with open arms. They appreciated that feedback. My understanding is that there's also going to be a survey up on the UVM website to solicit feedback from the community, and that's going to be open to anyone to submit written comments. But I've heard, a little bit of frustration from some students who haven't seen those ways to get involved yet, and I hope that the survey and maybe some other places will be good places for them to plug in. I've heard that on other campuses there have been really progressive kind of open community discussions to involve people coming in town hall meeting style, which is another model that could be done. I'm not sure it will happen here, but it could happen to solicit feedback from the community.
I was going to say, just to kind of go off of that a little bit, this is just happening. The paradigm's actually starting to shift, where now students are involved in that conversation and the faculty administration are involved in that conversation, where before they weren't. Local food wasn't even thought about in UVM's contract that happened 10 years ago. So this is continually changing and adapting, and we're learning from it. So.
Great. Well, I want to give a round of applause to our panelists. Thanks so much for being here.